Welcome. I'm James Foster, the co-director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP as we call it, here in the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University in our nation's capital. I want to thank all of you for being here for today's fascinating presentation by Ralph Chami of the International Monetary Fund and Sunil Sharma of Duke University on valuing nature, whales, elephants, and the global economy. Thank you, Dr. Chami, for taking the short virtual stroll down 19th Street to join us today, and Dr. Fullenkamp for joining us here in beautiful Durham. This event is part of a new series at IIEP entitled Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy, and is being co-sponsored by the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University as part of its series on finance and sustainability. In just a moment, I'll turn over the mic to the co-organizers, Dr. Ann Florini at Thunderbird and Dr. Sunil Sharma of the Elliott School, who will set the stage and introduce our distinguished guests. But first, just a few words about the Elliott School and our institute. The Elliott School is a top-rated international affairs school located strategically at the heart of DC, next door to the World Bank, the White House, the State Department, and the Fund. For those of you who haven't been to an IIEP event before, you can expect a nonpartisan, lively, and informative conversation. Our Facing Inequality webinar series is a multidisciplinary conversation on what is perhaps the main socioeconomic challenge of our age. Our 13th annual U.S.-China conference began last month with a keynote address by World Bank Chief Economist Carmen Reinhart and continues tomorrow when Michael Song of the Chinese University of Hong Kong and John Rogers of the Fed discuss pandemics in China and China. Next month, our Envisioning India series brings Pranav Bardhan to GW along with discussants Michael Walton and Jean Drey for a conversation on capitalists in India. If you can't make it to an event, videos can be found on our YouTube channel at IIEP GW. Now let me welcome the co-organizers of today's event to the virtual podium. Sunil Sharma came to IIEP as a distinguished scholar after 25 years at the Fund in many key roles, including directing its training institute in Singapore and helping lead research operations here in its headquarters. My earliest memories of Sunil are from graduate school days when I had the pleasure of repeatedly experiencing his first attempts at cooking food in the apartment below. I'm not sure who was the better cook, Sunil, you or your roommate, T.C. Anat, who would later become chief statistician of India. Ann Florini is clinical professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, Arizona State University, where she directs programs at the Washington, D.C. campus, a position which brought her back to D.C. after his distinguished career leading academic initiatives and conducting research at Singapore Management University and Brookings. We begin with Ann for a few introductory comments. Ann?
Thank you very much, James, and it's a real pleasure to co-sponsor another event with you and with your institute. Let me add my welcome to that of James to everyone who is participating here. This is, as James mentioned, in addition to being part of the George Washington University series on the future of capitalism, is also the first webinar in a series that Thunderbird has just launched on finance and sustainability. I would particularly like to welcome the students in our Washington-based mid-career Executive Master of Arts in Global Affairs and Management, and potential students who are also watching this webinar. For those who are current students, you may recognize one of the speakers today and some of the speakers in future events as people who are guest lecturers in the course that we just offered on international finance, taught the new way. It is a real pleasure to be here with you all. And with that, let me turn it over to Sunil.
That of James and Ann. Before I start, let me say a few words about the IIEP Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy series. The COVID-19 pandemic has been or is a deadweight loss for the global economy. But like the global financial crisis a decade ago, it has laid bare the cracks in the leading economies. The challenges are many: polarized societies and a lack of social trust, inadequate health and social security systems, high debt among financial and non-financial institutions, households and governments, income and wealth inequality, deficiencies in corporate governance, weak government oversight and regulation, and destruction of the environment. The three spheres of well-being, political and social, economic and financial, and the natural environment are each becoming more fragile, while their complex interactions are producing some very wicked challenges. The IIEP webinar series on Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy examines these difficult questions and possible policy responses. And the critical questions do cut across disciplines, like today's seminar: valuing nature, whales, elephants, and the global economy. Our economies depend critically on natural services provided by a variety of ecosystems. But those ecosystems are being rapidly destroyed by failure to value the services. As the realization grows that nature provides finite and often irreplaceable inputs into our livelihoods, new methods are being developed to value natural capital and incorporate those valuations into markets and public policy. In today's webinar, Ralph Chami and Colin Fullenkamp present a valuation framework that can be used to build public-private partnerships, create employment opportunities, and cultivate an environment-friendly global economy. Let me say a few words about the speakers, both of whom I've known for over 2 decades. Ralph is an assistant director of the IMF and leads the Western Hemisphere division of the IMF Institute. Previously, he was in the Middle East and Central Asia department and ran their regional economic outlook, and then program work on fragile states. He has a forthcoming book on macroeconomic policy in fragile states, co-edited with Rafael Espinosa and Peter Montiel, and it should be coming out early next year. Conal Fullenkamp is Professor of Practice and Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Economics Department at Duke University. He has created 4 video courses on financial economics for the Great Courses and is also an educational consultant to the New York Times. His research focuses on financial market development and regulation, remittances, effects of financial flows in fragile states, and the use of valuation in conservation and restoration of natural resources. As I said, I've known Ralph and Conal for over 2 decades. Starting in the late 1990s, Ralph, Burkhard Dries, and I worked together to create the finance group at the IMF Institute. Conal was involved from the very beginning. He was the first consultant we hired. And in the initial years, we also got a lot of intellectual support from Peter Montiel of Williams College and Raghu Sundaram of the Stern School of Business at NYU. We traveled the world together, organizing seminars for central banks, treasuries, and financial regulators. So today it is my great pleasure for me to moderate the webinar on valuing nature by Ralph and Conal. We'll organize the seminar as follows. Ralph and Conal will speak for about 35-40 minutes, and then Ann will offer comments for about 10 minutes, and then we can open it up for Q&A. Ralph, the floor is yours.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for the wonderful introduction, and thanks to Ann and to James. It's really wonderful to be here with everyone. And so this work is very much with my colleague Conal Fullenkamp and Thomas Cosimano, who could not be with us today. Thomas is an emeritus professor from the University of Notre Dame. The 3 of us have worked really hard to bring this, with what I believe to be good news for everyone. So allow me to share my screen with you. So what we'd like to do today is, in the time that we have, Conal and I decided to tell a story, and for the next 30 minutes or so. And in case you need to go, because we know we're competing with other webinars and other demands on your time, we thought we'd start from the story's end, from the last chapter. And maybe that way, if you were to leave, you'd at least know what the end of this story is going to look like, and maybe you'd be intrigued and stay around and see how we develop the ending of the story. So when this story ends, it's going to end up really beautifully, because we're going to be talking about what we call the win-win model. We claim that what we're going to end up with is a new economic paradigm which has nature at its core, or weaved into its DNA. And we believe that once we are able to do that, then it is the paradigm that will truly bring to all of us economic prosperity that is sustainable, inclusive, and by its nature, by its very nature, is nature friendly. I want you, just before we start with chapter 1, I just want you to contrast this with the current paradigm that we are living in right now, which I call the current story, which really is a win-lose proposition. The current paradigm is responsible for separating us from our natural world. The current paradigm is the one that views the house in which we live, which is nature, views it as an externality. And also this current paradigm makes another horrendous assumption that nature is free and endowed with infinite commodities. What this current paradigm has delivered to us is what we're all worried about right now, which is climate change. And an example of a climate change is a COVID-19 crisis, an invisible virus that presumably started in a wet market that you and I probably will never visit. This virus has managed to kill over 1.25 million people, destituted many others, with losses, horrendous losses to the global economy, and driving a lot of people into poverty and destitution. So the hard lesson here for us is that nature is macrocritical, and the idea that we are somehow separate from nature, or that, as we used to read when we were kids, that man is master of the beast or master of nature is just, excuse my expression, hogwash. It's nature is in the process of taming us and reminding us that we came from this natural world, and the sooner we realize that, the better off we're going to be. So since this is a story about how nature is part of our economic paradigm, or ought to be, then we got to start with, when you build any model, you got to start from the data, what's given. What is it that we know? So here we're going to start with science. So what does science tell us? Science tells us that the oceans, if you're thinking of the blue economy, the oceans are the lungs of the planet. In the oceans, you have these microscopic organisms called phytoplankton, and those phytoplankton do something really incredible. They absorb carbon dioxide, about 30%, and in return, they give back over 50% of the oxygen that we breathe. 50%. That means every other breath that you and I take, we should be thanking this microscopic organism that floats in the ocean for providing the oxygen for us. If you like to visualize the amount of carbon dioxide that these microscopic organisms are able to absorb, they are able to absorb per year roughly the carbon dioxide of 4 Amazon forests. 4 Amazon forests. It shouldn't be too surprising for you, because after all, 4/5 of the planet is water. We only live on 1/5 of it. Science also tells us something else very interesting, that in these vast waters live these great whales, the 9 species of the great whales, and they do something incredible. By the way, the blue whale, you may not know that, is the largest creature that ever lived. It is larger than any dinosaur you've ever read about in a history book or visited in a museum. And those great whales absorb so much carbon on their body. Roughly, on average, is about 9 tons of carbon. And, or if you like to think of carbon dioxide, there'll be about 33 tons of carbon dioxide on their body. Now, these whales, because they're so large, when they die, they're negatively buoyant. They sink to the bottom of the ocean, and when they do so, they sequester the carbon there for a very long time, because it does not interact with the atmosphere. Okay, so that carbon on their body is sequestered, not only captured, but also sequestered. Also, these whales turn out to do something even more puzzling and interesting. These great whales, baleen whales, they call them, because they don't have teeth, except for the sperm whale, they feed on something very, very small called the krill. So the whale feeds on the krill, and this krill, which is small, it looks like shrimp, but much smaller, feeds on the phytoplankton. And I just told you that the phytoplankton capture a lot of carbon dioxide, 37 gigatons of carbon dioxide to be exact. So the whales feed on the krill feeds on the phytoplankton, and the phytoplankton, in order for them to survive, they need 3 things. They need phosphorus, nitrogen, and iron. And all three of these ingredients are found in the fecal plumes of these whales. So imagine this wonderful circle, virtuous circle. The whales eat the krill feed on the phytoplankton, and the phytoplankton needs 3 nutrients, and those 3 nutrients are found in the fecal plumes of the whales. So in a way, in a sense, you can think of these very intelligent creatures. They're fertilizing their own food. They know that when they release their fecal plumes, the productivity of the phytoplankton would increase, and there'll be more of them. Therefore, there'll be more krill, and because there's more krill, they can eat more. And by the way, whales are not the only ones that feed on krill. When there's more krill, there's more fish and other ocean cetaceans that basically feed on the krill. Now, what's important for us and for here is that then the question becomes well, how much do whales really capture in carbon? Well, I just explained to you that on their body, they capture about 9 tons of carbon or 33 tons of carbon dioxide. But as importantly, what they capture is indirectly by fertilizing the phytoplankton, they help to capture even more. So one whale, science tells us that one whale is, in terms of carbon sequestration or carbon dioxide sequestration, is equivalent to thousands of trees. On land, their cousins, the elephants, this is very recent science, 2019, paper by Fabio Berzaghi, a colleague of ours, and his colleagues. They discovered that the elephants, and these are the elephants in the forests of Africa. These are not the savanna elephants that you probably have visited in Kenya and other places and as a tourist. These are elephants that you hardly ever see because they're hidden in the forests. And many of these countries in which they reside are going through civil strife, so you're not able to see them. Nevertheless, what these elephants do is something really incredible. As they go around and in order to eating, foraging, and moving around in the forest, they walk over the small shoots, the green shoots, and therefore providing more space and more light for the older trees to grow bigger and taller. And so what these scientists have managed to do is to study the impact of the movement and the eating habit of these elephants on the increase in the carbon sequestration by these forests. And they found that one elephant, for example, can help increase sequestration of carbon dioxide by about 9,500 tons per square kilometer. So if you like to think of tree equivalents, one elephant would be roughly equivalent in terms of carbon dioxide sequestration to about 2,200 trees. That's what science tells us. Science also tells us that salt marshes, if you like, seagrass, mangroves, also capture a lot of carbon. And this is just one example from England, the salt marshes of England, they only have 10% of them left. They've lost many of them. The 1 hectare of salt marsh captures 5 tons of carbon dioxide per year. And they tend to live for a very long time if they're healthy. But these salt marshes and mangroves and seagrass also are a natural defense against floods. Okay, so these, whether it's the elephant, whether it's the whale, or whether it's the salt marsh, these are natural assets, if you like, that provide an incredible service to us. And that's in terms of carbon sequestration. They provide many other services, but just focusing on the carbon sequestration, you have these natural assets that are natural defense, if you like, against climate change. So in short, what this is telling us is that the living whale and the living elephant and the living forest and living salt marsh are very valuable to us. And by the way, the living whale, the whale is interacting with the phytoplankton, is interacting with the krill, the elephant's interacting with the forest and the soil and so forth. So these are all examples of biodiversity, if you like. So what this science is telling us is that these are very valuable to us. These creatures, be it cetaceans, non-cetacean, it doesn't really matter. They capture a lot of carbon. And in terms of that service, they're very valuable to us. So you would think, well, if they're very valuable to us and to our own existence, they must be priced really high, okay? Because we live in a market economy, and you think if something is valuable, it has to have a positive price. And in fact, Mark Carney recently opined that the price of everything is becoming the value of everything. So the question here is, well, the elephant is very valuable to us, the whale is very valuable to us, the salt marsh is too. What's the price of a living elephant or a living whale? Well, in the case of the whale, the price of carbon service by a living whale is actually zero. Why? It's very easy, because you can see them being killed mostly by ship strikes, and the ship that hits and skewers a beautiful creature such as the whale and sails into the port doesn't pay a price for killing the whale. However, the moment the whale is dead, it becomes worth 40,000 to 80,000, depending on its size, in countries where they still eat whale meat. So how is it that something that, when it's alive and well and is capturing carbon, incredibly valuable to us, has a price of zero, but the moment you kill it, it suddenly acquires a price? Same thing in the case of the elephant. The price of the carbon service by a living elephant is currently zero. But when the elephant is, we lose the elephant to poaching and their ivory is sold, then the one elephant fetches 40,000. So something is amiss. And what's amiss here is, what we're really talking about is two different paradigms. One is extractive, which is you only value things when you take them out. When you take the whale out of the water, you kill it, and then you sell it as meat, then it's when it's valuable. But when it's in the water, alive and well, and is able to capture carbon, it has no value. Same thing with the elephant. When it's roaming freely, allowing the forest to grow bigger and wider and capture more carbon, and both of them are fighting climate change, they're valued at zero. But the moment they're dead, they fetch a positive price. So what's missing? And here I'm going to hand it over to Connell to talk about what's missing.
Thanks, Ralph. As Ralph mentioned, what is really needed is a paradigm shift, moving from an extractive view of nature to a regenerative view of nature that values nature when it's alive and healthy. We've seen some movements in that direction, and on this slide we note that at the last COP25 meeting, there was an acknowledgement that the ocean is essential to mitigating climate change. So a very beginning to acknowledge the services that natural resources provide. But as Ralph and I and Tom are tried to argue in our research, we need not only a paradigm shift in how we view nature, but really a paradigm shift in how we value nature. And that's what I'm going to tell you about in the next few slides. So our approach really starts with this idea of how do we get policymakers and other decision makers to value nature and actually take action to preserve nature and to restore it ultimately. And we thought that the best way to do that is to speak the same language that everybody who is talking about the cost of preserving nature is speaking. They're speaking the language of dollars and cents. And so we need to speak the language of dollars and cents when we talk about the benefits of a healthy nature, of a regenerative view of nature. So we decided intentionally to only focus on the values that we could get market prices for. So there are all kinds of services that Ralph described that natural resources provide, and we're only going to focus on those services that we're confident in measuring and confident that we have reasonable market prices for. The idea there is then we have a credible lower bound on the values of all of these resources. And as we'll show you, these lower bounds are actually quite significant. They capture people's attention, they capture people's imagination, and it's a great starting point to help people realize the vast value of the natural resources. So if we turn to the examples, so for example, one of the things that we did value, of course, is the whale. And we found that the various services that they provide, especially carbon capture and fisheries enhancement and even whale watching, contribute to a value on average of a live whale of over $2 million, which is a far cry from the $20,000 to $40,000 that a dead whale would fetch. Similarly, when we turn to the case of elephants and only valuing the carbon sequestration enhancement that Ralph told you about that elephants provide, we calculated a value of over $1.75 million per elephant. Now, in the cases of whales and elephants, this includes not only the current population, but also it takes into account the future growth of the populations that we can achieve by restoring these whales and elephants to their former population numbers. Finally, we've also done valuations, again, in cooperation with the UK Environment Agency, of salt marshes. And just thinking about the carbon sequestration services, as well as some of the flood control services provided by salt marshes in England, we came up with a valuation of over $136,000 per hectare, which is really quite an impressive value, and it makes it very, very, very pricey real estate indeed. So when we take all of this into account, we see that nature has an incredible amount of value. It is really actually a new asset class, a new source of wealth that's been sitting under our noses for all of this time. And using our approach, we can actually start to put a price on that value and really start to think about how to create markets around that new asset class to benefit not only nature, but also to benefit the people who live around nature and live with nature. So that's a really positive and happy part of the story. But Ralph is going to bring us back to reality for a moment and say, well, it isn't all wealth discovery and sunshine here.
Okay, all right. So so you would think the science is telling us how valuable these creatures are, how valuable nature, a living nature, by the way, is to us. And then we come around and we say, okay, let's put a market value on the services that we can observe. And you think everything is hunky-dory, everything is fine. But when you look around, you still find that nature is still tremendously under threat. Over 1 million species are now at risk of disappearing. You find that forests, we've been losing forests at an alarming rate. The size of South Africa, for example, is already lost to the world. And when you look at the blue carbon ecosystems, be it mangrove, seagrass, or salt marshes, coral reefs, we're losing them at a very high rate, annual rate. So obviously that the science is telling us they're valuable. Obviously that the valuation is telling us they're incredibly valuable in this market system is not enough. So the question is, what is needed in order to basically bring this in a functional way so that we can bring nature into our economic life? Well, what we really need is policy. And you can value assets all you want, but in order for an asset to become a capital, you need to codify it in the law. And that's well understood. And this is where the state comes in and basically approves that this asset is a capital, and then you can put it on the books and you can claim it as a natural capital. So the first thing we need to do is, if it is something that is valuable to us, then that something should have a legal right. We should endow it with the legal rights. We should put the regulatory framework around it. And once something is declared an asset, for example, in the case of the whale or the elephant or the salt marsh, and a value is attached to it, then the next thing is, well, this asset is valuable, so you want to monitor. Monitor is health and wealth. And if there's any infringement on this asset, there has to be an enforcement of punishments. But if you really want to create markets, you need to go beyond the enforcement and the penalties to create incentives to bring the private sector into the game and create meaningful income and employment for everyone involved. So these are examples. We wanted to give you examples of what's happening around the globe, and these things are picking up much faster now. New Zealand, for example, recognizes that it's Wanganui River and its forests are as a legal entity, meaning they've conferred personhood on the rivers. And this is incredible, because once you confer personhood, a legal personhood on something, that means it has rights and you have obligations towards it. Ecuador's constitution was amended to include the rights of nature, so nature has rights. Bangladesh, for example, recognized that its Turag River as a living entity with legal rights along with all the rivers. In other countries, as in Costa Rica, for example, the bees have been conferred on personhood. So once you confer personhood, once you put in these things into motion, along with the valuation, then the markets start to look at you differently, because they realize this thing now is an asset, now it's a capital, and now it's protected under property law, property rights law, or if you want corporate law, whatever law is already on the books, that endows it with durability, with universality, with convertibility, with priority. And then the markets start to look at you differently. And I'm going to show you, pretty soon why this is really why this is now happening today and not yesterday. But once you have all these things in place, then that attracts the attention of the private sector, be it the ones that want to use the carbon sequestration on services of these creatures, or those that want to make markets in protecting these creatures. That allows them to look into this and say, hey, there's profits involved in this, but profits in a living nature, not an extractive view of nature. But once it comes in, partners with the government, then you are now talking about a market around living organisms, living nature, and that is going to create the local employment and local ownership. And along the way, you're also diversifying the economy away from, for many of these countries, primary exports of primary products. So what we're going to do next is to bring this kind of example to life. Colin is going to take you through an example of how such a thing can be put into, taken to the market.
Thanks, Ralph. That takes us to our example of Gabon. And we're going to use this as a great way to make concrete this idea of using valuation to facilitate the creation of markets that then facilitate the preservation and hopefully the restoration of species and habitats. So Gabon is a Central African country, as the map shows. It has 45,000 forest elephants, which is just under half of the remaining forest elephants. It has 2.1 million people and 13 national parks. We're going to focus on one of the national parks for our example. So if we go to the Loango National Park on the next slide, Loango has 1,500 elephants roaming around over its 150,000 hectares of forest. So if we just took that as an example, we could say, given the valuation that we've created that says that individual elephant is worth about $1.75 million, we could multiply that by the number of elephants and say immediately that the value of those elephants just in Loango National Forest is about $2.6 billion. What can the country of Gabon do with that? Well, first, they can put that $2.6 billion right on the balance sheet of the country. That's an asset. That's a piece of capital that belongs to the country. And they could then use that capital as collateral to do things like enter into debt for nature swaps, perhaps, or even issue green types of bonds or securities. What that would do would be to bring in a very large lump sum of money into the country for the government to do various projects, including, of course, preservation and restoration of this asset that is providing that value. If the country didn't want to do that, they could actually go to the market like the carbon offset market and sell not the lump sum of the total value of the elephants, but they could sell the individual flows of services on a year-by-year or multi-year basis. So if you look at the middle of the slide, we talk about this market a little bit. From our calculations, we have calculated that an elephant captures about 63 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. So if we multiply that by the current carbon market price, which we're taking from the EU's ETS market of about $25 per metric ton, that means that in a given year, an individual elephant is going to generate a flow that's worth about $1,600. Again, we can multiply that flow times the number of elephants to come up with a number of just under $2.4 million of valuable service flows per year. And so the government of Gabon could basically sell carbon offsets of about that value based on those carbon flows. Who would want those carbon offsets? Well, as we're seeing, both countries and individual firms are looking to offset their carbon footprints, and firms especially are also looking for ways to improve their ESG scores with investors. So there are lots of potential buyers for this newly created market for carbon offsets. The cash inflows would go to the Gabon government, and of course would be passed on to the local communities, who would be then paid to look after the elephants and make sure that they're well cared for, that they're healthy, that they continue to provide these services. So that would provide income to these communities, and that would also help to crowd in the creation of other types of markets. It could crowd in the creation of an insurance market, could crowd in the creation of monitoring markets and other subsidiary markets. Once the cash comes flowing into the local communities, then we have other entrepreneurial projects that will probably arise. So it really looks like, as Ralph said earlier, a win-win type model in which the firms get their carbon offsets, and the local communities, as well as the national government of Gabon, get cash inflows that they can use to preserve nature and also do other things with. So that's our example of this, and that helps create that. And Ralph is going to move on and talk again, about why we can do this now and why we haven't been able to do that before.
Okay, good. So the question must, we're guessing on what could be on your mind, which is why now? Why are we talking about this now? Why weren't we able to talk about this a few years ago? What's different now? First thing is climate change is upon us, and it's approaching very quickly. We're all worried about breaching the 1.5 or 2 degrees. And so this is a calamity that is fast approaching us at a very fast speed, especially that we have not yet gotten our act together globally to meaningfully tackle this crisis. So what does that mean? Well, from the demand side, you have the Paris goals, and the Paris goals basically makes it imperative that we avoid the 1.5 to 2% breaching the 1.5 to 2 degrees. But that implies that the global community and companies have to commit to a carbon neutrality by 2050. So you don't want to breach the 2 degrees, which generates commitments to basically going carbon neutral by 2050. Well, that means there must be a upswelling of demand for carbon neutrality technologies. How are we going to do this? Okay, so basically you can either do it through change in technology. Maybe we can come up with a technology that allows you to do the same old, but with no additional carbon without adding carbon into the atmosphere, we have to think of carbon offsets, such that when companies through the normal operation of their business result in carbon dioxide going up into the air, there must be some carbon offset technology that basically takes it out of the air. So what's happening is there's now demand that's coming up from the private sector, from governments, from firms, and so forth, all looking for, and investors trying to figure out what is out there in terms of carbon sequestration technologies. And that has generated from the private sector a push for accountability. And we're giving you some examples of these things. For example, there's a very new report just came out by Mark Carney and colleagues. It's called the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, basically talking about a voluntary market with demand and supply and how you set up the market for carbon. There's another task force on nature-related financial disclosure, on carbon-related financial disclosure, and the ESG indicators. All of this is coming from the demand side. Well, what's coming from the supply side? That's what's new also, is new science measures carbon sequestration from more ecosystems and biodiversity sources. And the examples of the whale, the elephants, salt marshes, seagrass, and so forth are examples of these things. So this new research, it leads to the creation of what we call the nature-based solution to climate change. These are the carbon offset technologies. These are natural technologies that have been around for millions of years. So we don't have to worry about other externalities or other spillovers that come from artificial technologies that solve something and may create other problems. And the economics allows us to take this natural ecosystem to the market by valuing it using the services for which we have prices. But all of this needs policy. Policy is what's going to allow us to take the assets and claim that they are natural capital. As Con will show you, you can put them on your balance sheet or you can trade on the flow. And finally, the third leg of this tripod is technology. We couldn't talk about this before because we just didn't have the technology to monitor and track the health and wealth of the natural assets. That technology is literally brand new. We have also in terms of how we're going to arrange the payment system, how we're going to work on the payments that's going to go between those that are going to demand carbon sequestration, those that are going to provide. Well, fintech technology is there that basically now allows you to have direct payments. You can do micropayments. You can, in fact, ensure that the payments go to the local communities that are supposed to look after these natural assets. And in fact, it leads to the democratization and equitable sharing of new wealth and inclusive growth. So when you put all of this together, we end up where we started this seminar by talking about the final chapter. This is the final chapter, a final chapter that is predicated on the understanding and the recognition that we humans have to come back to our natural world from which we came, and that we understand at the core that the sustainability of our own economic system and our own well-being depends very much on the sustainability of the ecosystem. And once we understand that, then we have all the techniques, we have now all the ways to take that knowledge, that recognition to the markets, because after all, we live in market systems, and create markets around a living nature. I'd like to underscore that, you only get value when this nature is alive and well and thriving. But only then, when nature is alive, partnering with us, then we can really talk meaningfully about economic prosperity that is sustainable, that is inclusive, and by its nature is nature friendly. And with this, I'd like to thank you. This is a picture from our colleague, Roger Proudfoot. This is on our first trip to Sea of Cortez, where we met the blue whale for the first time, which basically started this whole trek, if you like. Thank you so much.
Ralph and Conal, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. And now the floor is yours, Anne, for about 10, 12 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much. Ralph and Conal, every time I hear more about this work, I am more struck by how profoundly transformational it is. What I'd like to do now is quickly set it in a bit of a context of how we are dealing with climate change, then add a bit of context on some related initiatives, and conclude by talking about what are the next steps. How do we get this kind of an approach very widespread and rapidly adopted if it has the potential that I think it does have? So first, why is this idea of putting a price on ecosystem services such a crucial component, not only of transforming what global finance is all about, but really immediately managing the climate crisis? You can think of our tools for managing the climate crisis as three legs of a stool. The first one is the one that we have heard by far the most about, mitigation, which is just stopping the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That is the core problem that is causing climate change. You can think of the analogy that's very often used is that of a bathtub. Right now, the bathtub is quite full. We are continuing to fill that bathtub rapidly, and mitigation is just turn off the faucet. Stop adding to the problem. The second leg is adaptation. We've got a bunch of climate change that is baked into the system. We're already seeing the results. We can't stop some degree of climate change from happening. We have to adapt to that. That's staying above drowning in the bathtub. But the third, and where this work is so fundamentally important, is this much newer idea that is beginning to get a lot more attention of climate restoration. How do we pull some of the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, but particularly carbon dioxide, out of the atmosphere? Because the levels are already much too high. And the bathtub analogy there is you unclog the drain and you widen the drain so that some of this massive amount of carbon dioxide that we have pumped into the atmosphere in recent decades goes back out. And that's what the carbon capture part of these ecosystem services is about. This is the essential third leg of the climate change trifecta. There's mitigation, adaptation, and restoration. I mentioned at the very beginning that some of our mid-career students in our Executive Master of Arts in Global Affairs and Management here in Washington had already heard from Ralph. And this is because at Thunderbird, we have a major initiative on this idea of climate restoration. How do you bring together a multi-stakeholder initiative that will pull together the wide range of actors that we need to have engaged if we are going to take this to scale quickly? This particular approach, where Ralph and Conal are focused on keystone species within ecosystems, and that's what the whales are and that's what the elephants are, and this focus on carbon gives us a fantastic starting point and a very rigorous starting point, because we know that key species affect whole ecosystems. And if we preserve them, we are preserving the whole ecosystem as well. So that's the climate context. This whole approach of creating a new property right with rigorous and defensible valuation fits in with a number of other efforts that are trying to endogenize nature into economic and financial thinking. Those of you in the audience who are familiar with the term natural capital have probably heard of the Natural Capital Coalition, which grew out of the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity study that was spearheaded by Pavan Sukhdev. And there is a wonderful TED Talk on that, which gives you the basics of this line of thinking about natural capital. But what the Natural Capital Coalition has done has been to focus on accounting approaches for individual companies that are trying to understand their own impacts on natural capital. It is not this broader valuation, and it's not a market-making approach. Similarly, Mars Incorporated has been a leader among large firms in its approach to natural capital. And it has a methodology that it has now spun off into a separate foundation and consultancy called the Economics of Mutuality Foundation that helps firms to think through, using very specific measures, how those firms are using or having an impact on natural capital. A very important methodology, but different and complementary to the one that Ralph and Connell are putting forward. So this approach of this valuation of ecosystem services really fills a gap. It is very innovative and it is potentially transformational in creating markets that don't currently exist. And this is a market that makes a lot of sense. We have increasing demand for carbon offsets. We have increasing supply for the reasons that Ralph and Connell spelled out of we have the technology now, we're beginning to have the scientific understanding, we can put these pieces together. And this is overall part of a broad shift that is needed from an extractive economy to regenerative economies, which create new incentives and create new political forces. Part of the reason we are in such an environmental crisis right now is that we have very powerful vested interest in the current way of doing things. This kind of valuation allows us to have vested interest in maintaining those ecosystems. So the extractors will not have all the financial power anymore. So the third point then is getting beyond valuation. Now we have this wonderful methodology. It is getting a massive amount of attention around the world. How do we get it widely applied? The presentation spoke of the need for legal rights, monitoring, enforcement, incentives. Now that valuation has a model, we need models for all the subsequent steps. This idea of legal personhood for ecosystems actually reminds me of the Dr. Seuss story, The Lorax, Who Speaks for the Trees, for anyone who's familiar with that one. Who actually has legal standing to object when the rights of these ecosystems are violated? How are the rights specified? Who has the political power, economic power, capacity to enforce that kind of legal personhood if that's the approach that's going to be taken? Very fundamental questions that need to be worked out. There are also questions about how one creates these kinds of markets where you're creating new property rights. In order to create property rights, governments either actively create them or tacitly allow them to be created. But property rights are susceptible to fraud and misgovernment. We saw that in some of the underpinnings of the great financial recession a decade ago. And figuring out how we are going to create these property rights in a defensible and consistent way is a big part of the problem. There's a huge need for simple and clear and adequate regulation so that if, for example, companies buy these carbon credits, these offsets from these ecosystem services, they actually get the ecosystem service for which they're paying. And the final question of how we move forward is how do you create a market in all of the ecosystems that cross national boundaries, which is a very large number of them. This may be a question for the future rather than the present, because there's so much work to be done, even for ecosystem services that are within a given territory. I think there's some very creative ways that we could think about how do you create global property rights. We have a model. The law of the sea created property rights for deep sea mining. Now, it ended up being very limited in its application, in large part because the US ended up never ratifying this. But there is an international seabed authority based in Jamaica. There is a model for beginning to think about how do you have these kinds of property rights. Do we engage the International Whaling Commission? Do we create some kind of new multi-stakeholder initiative bringing together all sorts of different parties? There are a number of models that are out there, and I think it is now time to start thinking those through. And my last point is to really appeal to everyone who is listening to this webinar to be thinking about what your role is in this kind of approach. As this approach catches on, we're going to need collaboration across many professions and many kinds of organizations to design and implement this at scale. The economist and ecologist, of course. That's what Ralph and Connell have been talking about. We will need lawyers. We will need business leaders in investment, insurance, companies that are emitting greenhouse gases and who are looking to offset them. Politicians, international organizations like the World Bank and others, social scientists. For my own field, which is global governance and international relations, this is going to be a fascinating and challenging field to be working in. And perhaps most of all, we're going to need community leaders and community organizers in the areas where these ecosystems are, because ecosystem preservation depends on effective collaboration with the local communities where these ecosystems are based. And if we can do that well, we have a solid and sustainable model for the long-term future. So for everyone listening, you have a role. Thanks very much. And Sunil, over to you.
Thanks very much, Anne, for those comments. Before I give the floor back to Ralph and Connell to respond to some of the issues that Anne has raised, a few things. First is, when you think about the price of elephant services, clearly we're thinking of the price of elephant services as part of an existing ecosystem. So in a sense, we cannot take the price of an elephant away from the environment in which the elephant itself is providing those services. So in a sense, we are trying to think in terms of ecosystem services rather than the services of an elephant itself. But that, I think, in some sense, is a broader question. And I think that you guys put it as a credible lower bounds that we should be thinking about these. So given what Anne just said, let me say, put up three broad questions that you guys can respond to. And then I'll open up the floor. First is, does the invisible hand need to be complemented by a visible hand? The invisible hand need to be complemented by a visible hand to start the market for natural assets. Is state intervention necessary to get the market going? If so, what role should the state play in creating financial markets around natural capital? Okay, so that's the first question. The second is, if these natural assets are valuable, and they are, is it possible to speed up their growth? And what is the scope for having a much larger population of, say, whales and elephants? And the third thing I'd like to raise is, do you think that financial valuation of natural assets will lead to their privatization and hence a reduction in what should be part of the country's commons or part of the global commons? So these are just questions to start off in terms of responding to what Anne raised. Ralph and Connell.
Connell, you can jump in anytime. These are, first of all, Anne, wonderful. Thank you so much for yes. kind of framing our work in the larger picture. And it's really, I was writing down every word that you trying to write down every word you were saying, and I would like to ask for your notes subsequently. And to do justice to the thoughtful comments that you gave will take more time. So I'm going to try to approach them and nest Sunil's three right on the money observations in this. So let me try, and Connell will have his own views on this. In terms of if we think, well, what did we say? We said, look, what's new is the science now is telling us, look, nature is very valuable to you. Nature, alive nature is valuable. By the way, when we talk about valuation, let me just say something that is clear to us, at least, is that nature is intrinsically valuable. So And that has nothing to do necessarily with what we're talking about. We're talking about the services that nature provide, services to us that we value. But every creature on this planet, green or red, is valuable, intrinsically valuable. Okay, so let's be clear on this. We're just talking about the services that they provide, for which we derive utility from. And so you have the science, we talked about the valuation, and then you come to a point, you say, okay, so I valued it, it's valuable. Is that enough to start a market? And this is where the question by Sunil, there's the invisible hand. Would the invisible hand by itself create a market? Well, we were, the three of us, professors of finance, and Connell still is, and we know very well that all of these markets in structured products or products you needed to take the asset and you needed to codify it. Okay, for example, to take mortgage-backed securities. Okay, take CDO squared, all of these structured finance that became capital that companies put on their balance sheets. You could only do that if the law allows you to do that. Could be under corporate law, could be on property, property rights law, whatever it is. But that is the law, and it's the state that allows you to do that. Because ultimately, when you convert something to an asset and it's a capital, you have what's called convertibility. The ability is to go to the bank and convert it into legal tender, which is a liability of the state. Only the state will allow you to do that. The invisible hand cannot allow you to do that. And anybody who studied corporate finance, history of corporate finance, will tell you it is the state that endows the monopoly to start the game. So it's the state, it's the role of the state. For example, in the case of the elephants in the Loango National Park, what Conlo was telling you is that we know these elephants don't go anywhere. There are 1,500 of them. There used to be a lot more. And these 1,500, they belong to Gabon. They don't belong to anybody else. They don't go anywhere else. Okay? The state owns them, if you like, as owns the forest where the elephants live. So let me jump to the third point that Sunil made, is that this idea of privatization. What we're talking about here, when we talk about privatizing the services of the elephant, meaning let's say you're Microsoft and you want to offset your carbon footprint, and you enter into this contract with the government of Gabon to offset your carbon footprint by using the carbon sequestration services of the elephants. You don't actually own the elephants. You own the services of the elephants, the carbon service, but the elephants belong to the country. This is like you, for example, I work for the International Monetary Fund. The IMF does not own me. The IMF pays me a wage for the services that I provide as an economist. It's the same thing. It's just that currently, under the current model, under the current paradigm in which we live, the value, the services that the elephants are continuously providing this carbon sequestration service, but they're getting a wage of zero. In fact, they're only valued when they're killed. The current model is the extractive model. It's the current model that you should worry about, because you don't even pay a price for killing an elephant and selling it. And you kill it for free, and then you sell it, and then you put in your pocket 40,000. What we're saying is, no, this elephant alive is worth 1.7 million. So you should be paying it a wage. And so the government becomes the steward that protects the elephants and gets that money, the 1.75, gets it, shares it with the local communities, whatever it is. You're paying the elephant for the services that it's providing, but you do not own the elephant. And remember, the value of that elephant, you can only get that value if the elephant is alive and well, thriving and having babies, and you can see that the forest is actually benefit from their activity. Now, I want to tie this back to the second comment that you made, Sunil, which is the speeding up the growth. When we did this model, we are macroeconomists too, and we like to think of gap models. In steady state, scientists tell us that there used to be 5 million whales in the ocean before whaling. Okay, nature deemed it that there should be 5 million whales. Where are we now? We have about 1 million. So what we do in the mathematical model, which is available on SSRN, what we do is we look at this gap analysis. How long will it take us to go from, so that's why we use a logistic model to allow you to basically look at not only the whales, the current population of whales, but the whales give birth to calves, and they only give birth to cows when they reach a certain age of maturity. The cows, some of them survive, some of them don't survive, and then, but eventually you end up at 5 million. Otherwise, people will say, why don't you just, why don't we have 1 billion whales? Well, nature says, even before whaling, it should be 5 million. Same thing with the elephants. We used to have 1 million forest elephants, and now we're down to below 100,000. And actually, they are on the verge of extinction at the rate we're going right now. So what we talk about is how do you, when we calculate the value of the elephant, we know that there's an upper bound. And as a result, what you're looking at is the growth of the elephant population towards what it used to be of 1 million elephants. So there is no such talk of basically having, 10 million forest elephants, because that nature did not deem it as such. So there's a going back to what it used to be before, and we can even tell you how long it would take you to double the population, and it's not easy because you just can't tell them, have babies, and they're going to have babies, right?
So Ralph, I have a question here, and
yes.
This is a question from Sean Brilliant, saying that, look, the whales and elephants have been sequestering carbon forever. It's just that we have now discovered that they've been providing this valuable service. So these are not new credits in any sense. We've been spending these credits all along. But the question is, how do we create additivity? Now that we understand what the whales and the elephants are doing, the question is, we need to create additivity. These are not new credits. These are just, we are learning how to account for them.
Yes.
So this is not additional to what is already being performed by these entities.
Right. Very good question. I'll let Connell. I have my own thoughts, but I'll give let Connell take this, and then I will.
Sure. So yes, we've been thinking about this concept of additivity quite a bit because that's a comment that we get quite often. We have lots of thoughts on that. I think additivity was a great way to try to jumpstart this movement toward restoration, but additivity is fundamentally incomplete. The problem, of course, is that if we're going to create a market around these services, that we have to pay for all of the services, not just the new services. And the focus on additivity, unfortunately, has led us to take the existing services for granted and also effectively give them a price of zero, which is really kind of a perverse incentive when you think about it. So one of the things that we need to do is actually create a unified market with a single price. That the carbon sequestration that's happening also has a positive price, and we need to actually reflect that. And as Ralph always liked to say, these whales and elephants have been toiling for years at a wage of zero, and maybe it's high time we paid them for these services. So that's one thought about additivity. We think it's fundamentally incomplete, and one of the things that we're hoping to re-engage a conversation on is to complete the picture of additivity by looking at the value of the existing services as well as additivity. And that is the only way we're going to have really a functioning market that has one price for everything. The other thing that I would say, and I don't want to take away any of Ralph's thunder on this, is that the way that we do the valuation actually folds in the additivity, because as Ralph just described, we're using these growth models to base our projections of the current value on the value of a restored species, which really has a lot of additivity in it. And so that's just another way to say that when people talk and focus on additivity, they're trying to pull things apart that really belong together. And I'll turn it over to Ralph to hear his more thoughts on that.
Can I just add a little bit of complexity to some of this? So there's a question here from Alison Fleming saying that the Gabon example is very enticing, but translating that into whales outside the EEZs, the economic zones, is much more trickier. So any initial thoughts on restructuring economic value for the high sea services, right? Because we're in many ways, we are dealing with the global commons, and the pricing, the global commons may be a much harder and more difficult and trickier issue than the Gabon example allows. So if you have any thoughts on that.
You're muted, Ralph. You're unmuted.
Okay. All right. And so, in fact, we tackled this in our first article on the whale, which came out last year, on the valuation, because I actually saw it with, I was there in the Sea of Cortez studying the blue whale, and I was asking, well, this blue whale, does it stay in the Sea of Cortez? And they say, no, this blue whale is going to move. And so I was thinking to myself, well, this is a global public good. So how are we going to resolve this issue? Well, there are a couple of things here. Yes, true. In the case of the Loango National Forest, or in the case of the mangrove, seagrass, salt marshes, they don't go anywhere. They're there. Okay, the Loango National Park, the technology tells you can actually monitor where the elephants are. And now we understand that they can identify each and individual elephant from their poop because they have unique DNA. And there's now even new technology that they can visually recognize the individual elephants. But barring that, let's go back into the seas. You're absolutely right. So, but not all species of whales are migratory, okay? We're doing work with Chile, Colonel I and Tom, and they have a wonderful initiative called Blue Boat Initiative, where they're looking at their ocean. They're trying to protect the whales and all creatures in their ocean. And our understanding from the scientists there is that the Chilean blue whale, which is a very important species, because of the long coast of Chile, spends 98% of its time in the waters of Chile. Now, you can say, well, so at least 98% of the value of the services of the whale. Remember, these are just valuation of the services, not the beautiful creature itself. It should accrue to Chile. And if 2% of the time it goes somewhere else, let's say it goes to Ecuador, then 2% of that value and will accrue. So you can do it. We can come up with a lot of sort of sharing arrangements. For example, some people own apartments in Florida for 3 months of the year. So for 3 months of the year, you have use of the apartment. For the rest of the year, somebody else. So we can think of agreements of how to share migratory animals. And I believe there are precedences to this of how these things can be worked out. But as my mom would always say, Ralph, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Let's get on with, because right now I just want to tell you that the price of a living whale remains zero. Today, a tanker could hit a blue whale after this seminar or during this seminar, and no one will be held accountable. So we need to move. We need to move on this. And the first thing you would move, let's on behalf of Chile, since we're talking about, is the government declares the blue whale a national asset. And a value, by the way, we worked with the scientists in Chile, and the value of the blue whale in Chile exceeds the 2 million. It's close to 4 million. And by the way, that's a price of carbon of $25 on the European exchange. And we all know that the price of carbon is going to skyrocket in the next few years. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure that one out, as the day of reckoning is upon us. So value of the whale is only, in terms of services, carbon service, only going to increase. So you can right now say, well, the whale is a national asset. For the time that it's in my waters, if a tanker were to hit a whale, you are going to pay a penalty of 3 million or 4 million. Guess what happens next, Sunil? What do you think will happen? Well, the probability of a tanker hitting a whale is incredibly small. So, you can have Lloyd's of London come say, hey, I'll insure the tanker against hitting the whale. Okay, what the Chileans are doing right now, the Blue Boat Initiative, is about putting acoustics in the Gulf of Corcovado, such that they can identify what kind of whale is in that water. Imagine. So using the buoys in the water with satellite technology, they can identify which whale is in the water. Now imagine if that technology allows to transmit information to the tanker. So the tanker now knows that there's a whale in the vicinity. And the insurance company would come in and say, of course, if you install that thing in your tanker, we will insure you, and at a lower premium. Suddenly what you're doing now, as Connell said, you're bringing insurance companies into the protection of nature, into protecting and allowing nature to thrive. So yes, there are issues when you have migratory species, and we don't want to make it sound as if it's easy, but when we all know that beyond the migration issue, pollution and climate is a global bad, and that is warranting us to coordinate our actions. So there's nothing new here in this respect. In fact, if you look at the Carney, the recent report by the Task Force for Voluntary Carbon, they talk about how a market ought to would come about, and what you would need for that market to take place in terms of meeting the insatiable demand for carbon sequestration, with the rising, with trying to provide enough supply of natural assets or artificial assets that can absorb the carbon.
I would just jump in and say that there is one thing that is new here, which is the realization that this is a potential source of value, and that only through international cooperation do we get to tap that value. And I'm hopeful that that will be an additional incentive for cooperation. I think Ann raised some excellent points about how we do have some precedents. It is difficult, but if nations are going to actually realize and tap that value for themselves, and if investors are going to have confidence in this market, it's going to be predicated on a certain amount of international cooperation. So that makes me more optimistic that this can actually be possible.
Great. And it will include, dealing with issues that Ann said, avoiding fraud, ensuring verification, because if I need to offset my carbon footprint, by the way, you can go on the website. There's a website now that tracks companies' commitments to basically carbon neutrality by 2030. And some of the biggest companies in the world are coming out now and saying, I pledge carbon neutrality by 2030 or 2040, 2050, which means the next thing they're going to have to do is they're going to say, how can I do this? I mean, do I buy carbon credits? Where's the supply going to come from? And so what we're saying is science is saying, look, the natural solutions, natural assets are there. We just have to recognize them as such through policy, and then provide, and suddenly you have an increase in supply of these assets that can try to meet the demand for sequestration. Otherwise, and by the way, we haven't even talked about the price of carbon, and that too is gonna warrant a coordination. You can't have just European exchange market at $25 and then in some other country at $0, and you know what's going to happen, right? Companies will arbitrage between those two. So there, even the price is we need to agree among each other what is going to be the price of carbon, that we're going to charge, so that firms and companies don't arbitrage across countries. And
you're muted, Sunil.
Another question. Do you believe that there is value in, this is a question from Richard Cliver, do you believe there's also a value in approaching this paradigm shift towards a circular win-win economy by making extractive industries pay for externalities and the true cost of damage, such as oil to climate change and plastic damage to the oceans?
Well, let's put it this way.
Which said that maybe these kinds of levies could be used to even say the shipping companies that lead to killing whales, these fines could lead to mitigation as well as mapping services that can be provided globally. So you can answer both those questions together.
So I'll take a shot and then pivot to Connell. In terms of remember when we valued the whale, for example, we looked at the whale through the carbon sequestration, through the positive impact on increase in fisheries, and through the increase in the revenue from whale tourism, which means now the government, which basically declares the whale. Let's stick with Chile for a moment. The Chilean government could, in principle, approach the fisheries industry and say, you've been benefiting from the positive externality from these whales, so there's an assessment for you. Okay, you can do the same thing with all of the pleasure boats that go out and watch the whales. Right? I was one of those in the Sea of Cortez. I was paying money to go watch the whales and study the blue whales. So there should be an assessment, and that assessment can go back into looking after the health and wealth of the ocean and the whales and the other cetacean, non-cetaceans in the water. But so definitely what this would do, let me answer it two ways. What this would do is would bring in these industries, which these are the extractive industries. Well, if in the case of the fisheries, industry that only values fish when you take them out of the water, when they're dead and served on a plate, you have a value. They start to endogenize the impact of their actions. You see that they've been benefiting, they've been getting a free ride from the whale that's been servicing them for forever, right? And so you start to have a more constructive engagement around creating this economy around this sort of living nature. But let's not stick only with the oceans. You could do the same thing with forests, because we know that in some countries where you have the Amazon forest, these countries are now, because of lack of tourism, okay, there are no tourists coming, and so they may be susceptible to basically people, trying to sell the wood in the forests, or mining companies approaching these countries and saying, why don't you let us mine in your forest, and we'll give you a sort of a token payment. What this exercise allows you to do is to say to the countries in which the Amazon exists, because, hey, you can, those credits from the Amazon forest, there's a market for those. You can sell the carbon. You can do debt for nature swap. You can do, as Connell said, you can go to the carbon market, and at least it would give you the true value of the forest that you have. And that's just in carbon, because forests are beyond carbon, the biodiversity itself. So that's why we always talk about the minimum. You can talk about all the other services that it would be providing, but that would allow the country to withstand the pressures from the extractive industries that say, here's a price, ad hoc price, or here's how much we're going to give you, right? $2 million, and let us now dig.
So Ralph, let me interject. We're running out of time. And let me ask one last question. How would a debt for nature swap work? Right? I mean, currently we're dealing with very high indebtedness in emerging markets and poor countries and so on and so forth. So it would be interesting to understand how a debt for nature swap would work.
Sure. Donald? Yeah, sure. I'll jump in on that. So debt for nature swap, it basically is a long-term arrangement in which the country would pledge its natural capital as collateral, and then it would kind of turn over the value of those services to the buyer of the swap, or the person who's paying for the swap, and the country in turn would get some debt relief. Under the agreement, they'd have to devote some of the freed up resources in order to engage in protection of those natural resources. So for countries that are engaged in debt for nature swaps, to get debt reduction, and they have what we call increased fiscal space. So they once again get the increased space to actually do some spending, and they have to spend at least part of the part of that relief amount on making sure that the natural resource that they've pledged is healthy and is maintained. For its part, the person who's buying the swap, so to speak, gets the claims on the flows, or some function of the claims on those flows, for a certain period of time, right? So even a debt for nature swap is going to be a limited time arrangement over which the person who is paying for it, so to speak, is going to receive some kind of value for the flows of services from those creatures. So it takes it out of the realm of simply international financial institutions and puts it potentially in the hands of private creditors as well.
I just want to add here, Sunil, is that this instrument is an old one. It started in the 80s during the Latin American debt crisis. But what's different about it now is that when it was done in the 80s and the 90s, there was no market for services of nature. There was no market because no one was thinking about the climate change. No one was thinking about the gloom and doom that's upon us. That we didn't have the technology. We didn't even have the science. The science on the whales, for example, that whales capture carbon is circa 2010. The science on the elephant itself is circa 2019. We didn't even have the technology. So what you get now, if you were to engage in debt for nature swap, is as Connell said, the owner of the creditor would get access to the services from the collateral, and that is incredibly valuable. But that also feeds back into the country that is engaged, because now the country that is engaged in the swap understands that its natural wealth its forest, for example, is incredibly valuable, and so it can ask for a better price for its debt. And now when it starts looking after the forest on behalf of the creditor, it also realizes that the creditor goes away because it's a swap. It has a limited period and it reverts to it. So in perpetuity, it's going to continue to benefit from it. That's why debt for nature swap today is not the debt for nature swap of the 1980s and the 1990s. It's a completely different instrument, if you like.
One is, are there any companies out there that are actually valuing nature? this is a quick answer. Do you know of any companies that are actually doing the valuations in nature?
Yes, I would invite your audience right now to go on Google and type in 8billiontrees.com. 8billiontrees.com right now. What they will tell you is they'll say, okay, how old are you? What's your income? How many people in your household? They will calculate based on that, on average, how much is your carbon footprint. Against that, they will say, okay, we're going to plant so many trees to offset your carbon footprint. Remember, this is flow on flow. And for that, you pay $40, I don't know, a month or something like that. That's already in terms of the trees. But I would invite everybody to look at this recent report by Carr et al. And to understand what it would need in order to build a market for voluntary, for basically voluntary carbon sequestration, because there is a demand. Definitely, and the demand is going to outstrip anything. What we need is to release the supply, and nature is saying, I'm here. I've always been here for you. Okay, how come? I mean, what I'm really always, I'm a financial economist, just like Connell and Tom, and we're always surprised when people find it much easier to understand how a mortgage-backed security has a market, and you're willing to buy it and put it on your balance sheet, something that doesn't exist in reality. Have you ever met a mortgage-backed security? Have you ever touched one? Have you ever shook hands with one? They find that much more easier to understand than when you say the services of the elephant. An elephant is in front of you. It's a physical asset. And you can trade it's the services of the elephant, not the elephant itself. They find that to be more difficult. But, and when we worked on the financial crisis with you, Sunil, and you all know very well CDO and CDO squared. People were trading it left, right, and center. And nobody had met the CDO, nobody had seen a CDO, nobody had even read the legal footprints of a CDO, but yet everybody was willing to believe in it. Why? Because JP Morgans of the world told you, trade it. But yet when we come around and say the science is telling you the oceans are valuable, mangrove, seagrass, salt marsh, Wales is just an example. There are many others. Suddenly people have like blocks. And I get sometimes questions like ethical questions. Aren't you privatizing? I'm like, no, because we are privatizing the services. Right now, it's the model that basically says kill with impunity, destroy nature with impunity. And what we're saying is a living nature is a source of wealth and health for all of us, big and small, humans and other creatures that have a right to live with us in this beautiful home of ours called the natural world.
If I can just give a slightly different answer to that same question, because
Sure.
yes, there's lots of companies that are doing the valuations. There's also lots of companies that are trying to figure out what is their own impact on natural capital. What are their negative impacts? How do they ameliorate that? How do they start being regenerative themselves? I mentioned Mars Incorporated has been a pioneer on this. There's the wonderful carpet tile manufacturer Interface, which set out to be, several years ago, decided that by 2020, they would do no net harm to the environment. They achieved that goal early, and now they are on to being regenerative. But those are just a couple of examples I happen to know well. There are scores of them around the world because the private sector is beginning to understand that a world in which we are destroying ecosystem services is not a world in which there is going to be business. Their business is in the future. You see it with Coca-Cola, which has discovered that if it doesn't protect the watersheds where its bottling operations are, it's not going to have the water to provide its product. So I think on both sides, we're seeing a very major corporate role. And just one last final comment from me, looking at some of the questions, is this going to put a stop to the sixth mass extinction that we are currently living through? Is this going to be sufficient on climate change? Well, clearly not by itself. But what this is, I believe, is an essential step, a necessary but not sufficient step for dealing with these massive planetary challenges. As I said at the beginning, this idea of climate restoration, which is what the ecosystem services approach is about, is one of three legs of the climate crisis management stool. And I think the same is true for ecosystem management. This is absolutely necessary, it's fundamental, but it's not a silver bullet. There are no silver bullets. We need as many of these kinds of steps as we possibly can. And that's why I think this is such a major contribution.
You can't top that.
Sorry. If there are any last comments that Ralph, you and Connell would like to make, we can end it. We're already 12 minutes over. We'd advertised till 1:15. So any last thoughts from the two of you?
One last phrase from my part. It's time for us to come home to the home that we've always known, the natural world. Imagine yourself living in your house. Your house protects you from rain, from storms, allows you to cook, to raise a family. Nature is our home in which we live. And just like you take care of the house, you take care of the roof, you take care of the maintenance of your house, we need to look after the house that has always been our home, which is nature. So only when we stand up by nature will nature in return continue to look after us. I'll stop here.
Yeah, I would only add that from our perspective, valuation is really the catalyst. Really understanding and recognizing the value that is there is the key step to giving everybody the incentive to get this thing going.
Okay, let me conclude the webinar by thanking both the team at the Institute for International Economic Policy for putting it all together, and for the great collaboration we have with the Thunderbird School of Global Management at ASU. And of course, thank you to Ralph, Connell, Ann, James, and thank you to everyone who attended and put up some very, very good questions. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you.